Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'll be taking a look at Troublemaker Sepia Hour. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples I did on other types of paper. I'll compare Sepia Hour to other inks from my collection, but I don't really have anything similar. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test and the chromatography. I didn't really enjoy writing with Sepia Hour using a glass dip nib because I had some trouble getting the ink to grab the paper. This swatch that I made with tweezers looks nice and crisp, but all the other tweezer swatches that I tried to do on other papers had a lot of trouble grabbing and holding on to the paper. The drip at the end of the swatch has some chromo shading or dual shading going on. You can see kind of a halo of bright yellow. And at the same time, there's a halo of a darker, I guess, sepia color. And I forgot to mention there's quite a bit of difference between the darker end of the swatch and the lighter end. I'm going to begin with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. On this really smooth Tomoe River paper, the writing experience wasn't bad, but for my personal taste, this ink is just a little bit too pale for this fine of a line. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Legno. It has a fine 14 karat gold nib. Compared to the extra fine, this fine nib felt even better. But again, for my taste, this is just a little bit too pale for this size of a nib, especially when you have these drier upstrokes. That really just takes away from the legibility of this ink. Next, I'll be writing with the Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Okay, now this medium nib is putting down enough ink that it becomes, I guess, legible enough for me while still, maintaining that pale ink. You feel like you're writing with a pale, dainty ink, but it's also legible enough. So I kind of like this. Now, as I'm writing this, you can see these Pilot medium nibs have this characteristic of wanting to drag the ink to the end of the pen stroke. Now, the end was nice and legible, but then as I got to the end of the word, I don't know, it's a little too pale. And then when I tried to draw this arrow, you can't even tell that that's an arrow. I don't know. I'm leaning toward not being super fond of this ink, even though the color itself, like I said, is kind of dainty and delicate. It's kind of a pretty ink, but I don't know how usable it would be for me. Next, I'll be writing with my Platinum 3776. It also has a 14 karat medium nib. I didn't mean to put that in parentheses. Now this kind of surprises me. I thought that this would be more legible. How I said that the Pilot medium nibs tend to drag the ink to the end of the writing stroke. In my experience, my previous experience, platinum medium nibs do a good job of laying down the ink more uniformly and tend to be more pleasant with these more pale inks. But this one, it's just too pale. And kind of like these previous two, I'm not fond of the legibility. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib. The same issue with the Pilot Metropolitan, or I'm having the same issue with the Pilot Metropolitan that I had with the 3776. It's just too pale. I'm kind of surprised in other writing samples, and I'll get to that later. Some of the other writing samples, a lot of these nibs just felt too dry. I haven't had that issue on this Tomoe River paper. The writing experience has felt fairly pleasant. My main issue has just been the legibility of it. Next, I'll be writing with my Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Okay, now that's much better. Just like I said with the grants, it's putting down enough ink that it's legible, but you still get that pale, delicate look. That's much better. And finally, I've got a Pen BBS cartridge converter pen. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. This is fairly light. I'm seeing a little bit of shading. It's mostly this lighter shade with little bits of the darker. You can see little splotches of the darker, but it's a wide enough line that it's still legible. It felt nice and pleasant. I was a little worried about how this might work out because on some of the writing samples, this ink had trouble grabbing the paper. But that's one thing about this Tomoe River paper. It's nice and smooth, but it's also good about grabbing the ink. You can see from the swatch up here where some of the papers had trouble grabbing the ink from the nib and holding on to it. Tomoe River paper does a good job of grabbing that ink and holding on to it and allowing you to write a nice uniform line and really minimizing the amount of skipping a pen and ink or a nib and an ink might have if it's prone to doing that on other papers. All right, while this dries, let's take a look at some of the other writing samples. Okay, here's what I was talking about with the tweezer swatch. You can see here at the beginning, I could not get it to grab the paper. It slowly, I had to write much slower than I normally do. A lot of times with my tweezer swatch, I have to make it pretty quickly or it'll just suck all the ink out of the tweezers all at once here at the beginning, so I'd have to try to do it quickly but uniformly. On this one, I really had to write slow and try to get it to pull that ink out, and it kind of did here at the end. On my glass dip nib, you can see how crispy that line is. Now, when I was writing with Herbon Cacao de Brazil, it made a nice crispy line, but it was a darker ink, and I didn't really have trouble with it grabbing the ink off the glass dip nib. It just pulled it off more consistently, and I could write at a normal speed. You can see with the T here on Troublemaker, I had trouble getting it to pull that ink off the nib, and the S and the H and the E. There was a lot of skipping with this glass dip nib. When I wrote with that stub nib, you can see it was very pale here at the beginning. I couldn't get it to grab that ink. I had to re-dip it, and it just felt really dry. And here's something I can tell you. If you're going to be writing with Sepia Hour on something like rhodia paper or even like copy paper, if you want to know what it's going to feel like, just take whatever your pen you're thinking about inking up and try writing with it on that paper uninked. That's what it feels like. This ink doesn't really provide any lubrication between your nib and the paper. It just feels like you're writing with a dry nib. So if you have a nice smooth nib, it's going to feel nice and smooth. If there's any feedback to your nib, you're going to feel every bit of it. All of these nibs just felt really dry, and you can see the Pilot Kakuno not very legible at all. Out of all of these, the Grants and the Kaveco looked good, and they felt okay to write with. I put that the Grants felt nice, but yeah, for this ink to provide a pleasant writing experience, it has to be a fairly wet nib. I also did a writing sample in my little Martha Stewart notebook. This is an old notebook. I've mentioned this before. It's got, let's see, Avery paper. I don't know much about that paper, but I do know it's usually pretty pleasant to write on with fountain pens. The only issue is it's not extremely fountain pen friendly. Most inks will bleed through at least a little bit, so it's really a one side of the page type of paper when you're writing with fountain pens. But I mentioned before that Cacao de Brazil didn't bleed through, and this Sepia Hour didn't bleed through. And because it's such a pale ink, there's not really any show through either. This was a fairly pleasant paper to write on. And like I mentioned on the other writing samples, the wider nibs were better, like the 1.5 stub and that Kaveco broad. And for me, I like finer nibs usually, but the Pilot medium nib was probably as fine as I would go with this ink. The shading looked really good on this paper. On my Leuchtturm paper, I had trouble getting the ink to grab the paper. Kind of like with my tweezer swatches, I really struggled with this one. And the color of the ink looked pretty interesting. You're seeing those dual shading qualities, especially when you swipe it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but kind of a pinkish layer stays behind and the yellow wipes away. That's kind of interesting. And it gives the writing a little bit of character, but it just wasn't pleasant on this paper. And on my copy paper, the 1.5 stub nib and the Kaveco broad were both okay. They look okay. And as far as the writing experience, they felt okay. And again, the Grants was okay, but everything else was pretty unpleasant. Okay, on these super smooth ink collection cards from Subame, I could not get the tweezer swatch to grab the paper. I tried and then it just let go. Then I dipped again and tried, dipped again and tried again, and then just gave up. The swatch here, I do it with tweezers also, but I couldn't get it to grab the paper, so I just had to kind of drip a little bit on the paper and then kind of swatch it around with my tweezers. And when you do that, it kind of roughs up the paper, so it looks a little grainy there. You can see I struggled writing the name with the dip nib. The scribble was nice and crispy. It didn't really skip, but it did skip when I was trying to write. The Pilot Legno was okay. It's that fine nib, but I'm writing really teeny tiny, so I think if I was writing any larger than that, it might not be as pleasant. The Grants was unpleasant because it's a wetter nib, and I think I was writing too small. I think if I were writing larger, it would be a little bit better, but it was just the ink was a little too blobby to write this small. The Kaweco was okay. I put a little smiley face beside it, but looking back at it right now, I'm not crazy about the legibility of it. My 1.5 stub, I couldn't get it to grab the paper, so it's pretty, those stubby letters just look like I scratched it on there with a stick. Okay, the closest thing I had was Three Oysters Buchanan, and I really liked this ink. I was kind of surprised. For me, this is a little lighter than I typically go for, but I really liked it when I tried it, but it's much more brighter and vibrant than Sepia Hour. Swan Illusion is another pale ink that falls into that category of ink that I'm typically not fond of, but I really do enjoy using this in my Pilot Grants. It gives a very kind of vintagey feel, old-timey feel to my writing. To me, this is kind of a color I think of as sepia. I don't really know what color sepia is supposed to be. I know there's a wide range of colors that people characterize as sepia, but I do kind of, I can't say that I don't like this color. It's kind of fleshy looking. If you think of it like that, that seems kind of gross. But on papers that kind of pull out the shading qualities, it can look nice. And one other ink that I pulled out was Cafe Crema. I don't know, this just shows you how unusual an ink this is. These were the closest things I could find in my collection. When I did the chromatography and saw that a bright yellow component moved quickly up the paper and a pale kind of lavender strip remained behind, I was kind of optimistic that there might be some slight water resistance. But when I did my water resistance test, I discovered that some of my ink pens were contaminated. The Pilot Legno was obviously contaminated, and I believe the Kaweco was contaminated from previously testing Cacao de Brazil. It looks like that's what was left behind. But some of the others I'm not sure about. After it has dried, I was kind of thinking that these were some lavender that was left behind, but now I believe these two were also still contaminated from Cacao de Brazil, because these two pens, nothing remained behind. So for now, I kind of messed up on this water resistance test. I'm going to rule this one not water resistant, not even a water resistant component. Okay, this writing sample on Tomoe River, this is probably your best case scenario, and this just reinforced the fact that the Grants with that 14 karat medium nib, that Pilot medium nib, the Kaweco broad, and if you have a nice wet stub nib, that could be okay. Bottom line, for my taste, you need a lot of ink on the page for this to look good and to be enjoyable to write with. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.